Welcome to the second week of the course on global civics. The two reports you have read for week one had one common theme, and that is our increasing global interdependence. Throughout the course, we will be reviewing different dynamics that are pushing us together, the centripetal forces. We will try to ascertain their similarities as well as their differences. Before we get there, though, maybe there is one notion we should unpack a little, and that is this idea of a global village. For the last 50 years, people have argued that increasing information technologies, advances in communication have meant that distances have shrunk and the world now feels like a village. In the reading that you have done for this week, The New Digital Age, this point is made especially forcefully. We will now turn to a short clip where we will hear from the director of the Global Civics documentary, Gianni, and the founder of Wikipedia, Jimmy Wales, about this very idea.
Historically, people around the world lived in villages like this. When you live in a village, you step out of a home and most likely you will see a familiar face. When you live in a city, you step out of a home and you will see a stranger's face. For the first time in human history, man can meet and chat with strangers all day long, right there in their bedroom. This is changing the way we relate to the world, and this is changing our understanding of community.
Today, the web of interactions among people all around the world is much higher than it ever was before. People have direct communications, direct trade across all kinds of borders. And the real issue is that governments can no longer think of themselves. They're really only one part of the overall system. It's not a series of states and then the people are under them. It's the state plays a role in the whole thing, but individual people have a much bigger role than ever before. And that's just going to accelerate, just going to continue.
So that was Gianni and Jimmy Wales on this notion of a shrinking world. We will now turn to Ethan Zuckerman from MIT, and he will both deepen our understanding and deconstruct this notion of the global village.
Hi, my name's Ethan Zuckerman. I direct the Center for Civic Media here at MIT's Media Lab at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Great to be with you today as part of this lecture series on global civics. Here at Center for Civic Media, we're really interested in this question of how media and civic engagement come into play and how they work with each other. But to talk about this today, I want to talk a little bit about the maps we make of the world and how we think about these maps of the world. So I wanted to start by showing you this image. This is perhaps the most reproduced image in the history of photography. This is an image shot in 1972 from the Apollo 17 spacecraft. It's the last time we had a spacecraft with the capability of human beings to take this shot. People actually on the moon aiming a camera back at the Earth and getting a full picture of the Earth fully illuminated by the sun, showing the continent of Africa and also showing Antarctica. And this image has had enormous significance for the global environmental movement. Many people credit the rise of an environmental movement in part to having this singular image of the planet, often referred to as the blue marble, of a fragile, delicate, ultimately interconnected single entity. And you can see throughout the 1970s how this image shows up in a great deal of environmental advocacy material and really in some ways shapes a dialogue about the environment as a planetary issue rather than as a local phenomenon of cleaning up waste or cleaning up pollution. One of the ways that I try to understand maps like this is through Benedict Anderson, who wrote a fantastic book back in 1983 called Imagined Communities. And Anderson points out that none of us has the luxury of knowing all the other people in our nation. We can't go out and meet all the other people that we share a country with, that we share a state with, in most cases that we even share a city with. Instead, we have to imagine those communities. And that community that we imagine is the group of people that we think of as fellow citizens, that we think of as the people that we are debating with and trying to persuade and trying to cooperate with as civic actors. And Anderson goes on to point out that there are objects that help us imagine our nation. For Anderson, probably the most powerful is the newspaper. He suggests that we might think of the British Empire as the people who were reading the Times of London. But there's other artifacts as well. We can look at a map of British Empire and we can see the ways in which the British Empire thought of itself as being globally spanning, always in the sun never sets on the pink areas of the map. These maps, these constructs, are a way of building our sense of nationhood, of building the civic body, of building the group of people who we are going to interact with to try to figure out how to solve a civic problem. And we do this with newspapers, we do this with maps, we do this with museums, we do this with a national census, we do this with all sorts of ways of constructing a group identity around these artifacts. So I've been asking questions lately about what are the sort of images, what are the sort of artifacts that help us understand the connected world that we live in. We're at this very interesting moment in time where we're deeply connected in physical terms. And that connection is often a dangerous one. We look at something like the spread of a disease like SARS or bird flu, and we can suddenly find ourselves acutely aware of the fact that we're connected to people halfway across the world. SARS starts in hospitals in China, very rapidly ends up infecting people in Canada, and suddenly people find themselves acutely aware of those air travel routes and the sort of vulnerabilities that come from them. And we need to be aware of this interconnectivity because some of the biggest problems that we face, problems like global warming, almost by definition are going to demand a global solution. So we need to have some sort of vision of the world that lets us think of ourselves as interconnected. And interconnection isn't always bad news. Sometimes what we get from the flow of ideas, the flow of memes and thoughts and art and inspiration across cultural lines is the inspiration towards new forms of creativity. There's actually a great explanation for this coming from a University of Chicago scholar, Ronald Burt, who wrote a great paper called Structural Holes in Good Ideas, where he looks inside a big corporation and is able to make the argument that the people who are bridging different corners of this big corporation have the most interesting and the most important ideas for the future of the business. And we could think of this happening globally as well. Some of the people who are spanning these global networks, who have the opportunity to see what's best and what's most interesting in different corners of the world, may be the people with a great deal of creativity who can bring new solutions to the table. So how do we think about this world? Well, one is to go back to maps. So this is a very simple map. This is a map that shows every commercial airline route in the world. It was put together actually as a hobby by a cartographer named John O'Sullivan. He got very interested in these sort of online databases of airplane flights. And he was able to look at this. And the message that we get from this map, or the message that I get from this map, is that anywhere in the world is 1 or 2 hops away from anywhere else. May not be the authentic message. It still turns out to be really difficult to get to parts of South America or parts of Africa. But at the end of the day, part of what this map invites us to imagine is this idea that we're interconnected from some very rich points of connectivity to some finer points of connectivity, but a few hops away from any point on the globe. Here's another map of networks that makes this point in some very different ways. This is a visualization of the spread of the first cases of SARS. And in this case, the nodes in the network are the cities linked by global air travel where the outbreaks happened. And on this map, we go from China to Canada in just 2 hops. And we find ourselves very quickly going from people initially infected to southern China who came through Hong Kong, who ended up transmitting to family members who'd come in from Canada. And suddenly, this local epidemic is a global epidemic, in part because of those global airline networks that end up pulling us together. Here's another way of thinking about this highly mobile world. This is a visualization called People Move In. If you're looking for it, it's MOV.in. It's a visualization of who emigrates and immigrates to different countries. So as you go through this site, you can see where the 2.3 million people leaving Afghanistan in the last year headed off to, and how many of them are heading to Iran, and how many to Pakistan, and how many into Europe, and what countries are receiving populations. What's that mobility of people locating themselves around a connected globe? Because it's become far easier to relocate yourself in a moment where air travel is relatively inexpensive, where borders are comparatively open, and where people find ways to look for economic opportunity wherever they can find it on the globe. One of the strange things about this moment of connectivity is that in many cases, atoms are more mobile than people. And in some cases, they're more mobile than bits, than the information we send around. It's hard for most of us to find an object as well traveled as a laptop computer. Here's a visualization from Leo Bonanni, who was here at the Media Lab, who got very interested in this question of where did his laptop come from? And it turns out that that's a very complicated question to answer. If you get down to the level of where did the minerals come to make the chips that build up my laptop, you end up with a graph that involves every continent of the world except Antarctica, that involves dozens of countries, hundreds of production steps. And you start looking at this artifact, this single thing with a price tag on it that you may have bought from a shop or bought online, but it's actually the end result of processes that are connecting large swaths of the globe together. So maps like this that determine where our things come from are another way of sort of visualizing these connected maps. Here's a map of how we're connected in terms of bits. Bits are theoretically highly mobile, in practice less mobile. They go where people demand them. And so you look at a map like this from telegeography, and this is a map of undersea cables, and you see enormous connectivity between the east coast of the United States and Europe, an area where tremendous amounts of information go back and forth, but much finer lines between Africa and the rest of the world, between Africa and Asia, and Africa and South America in particular. You start seeing a sense for where we like to send content, who likes to receive that content, what we pay attention to. It's theoretically possible that people in any continent of the world could be creating and sharing content, but we have a structure that represents where those ideas, where that information tends to flow, and those tendencies are embodied in these very expensive, very heavy undersea cables that actually tie us together in one fashion or another. Now, we might ask the question of how this comes about, and this is an image that for many people has ended up representing what a connected world and a disconnected world looks like. This is an image from NASA called Earth at Night. It's a synthetic image. It's basically a way of assembling a set of satellite images into a single picture. And when you look at it, one of the things that becomes most apparent is that while you can pull apart all the landforms we're looking at, there are large pieces of the globe that are dark. And dark simply means there's no electric power there. There might be no electric power there like Central Australia because there are very few people there. Or there might be no dots there like most of sub-Saharan Africa because there's no electricity there. And in a digital age where one of the precursors to connectivity is access to power and access to telecommunications, this may also be a way of thinking about a map of who we get to hear from, who we get to see, and who we don't. But this is the map that I really wanted to focus on. This is a map that was put together by a summer research intern named Paul Butler at Facebook in the summer of 2010. He ended up releasing the map at the end of 2010. And what this is a map of friendships on Facebook. When you sign up for Facebook, you tell Facebook where you live. Facebook, by the way, doesn't particularly trust you on this. Facebook also geolocates your IP and determines where you live. And Facebook knows where your friends live as well. And one of the many things that Facebook is interested in is who are you friends with and how do those ties shape the globe. So Butler took a very large set of that data, put it on a map, built arcs between the points. And what you end up seeing out of the map is that areas where there are a lot of people on Facebook simply light up as white. The connection is so dense that all you see is the light of those connections going back and forth. But what's really remarkable about the map is, of course, there are no pictures of the continents, yet you can pick out the shape of Japan, the basic outline of Africa, the outline of South America when you look at it. And for many people, I think this was a map that said, oh, so that's the connected world we live in. For all of us, there's someone we know in another country, there's someone who's a few hops away, we're only 1, 2, 3 degrees separated from the rest of the world. Maybe this is how we understand a new cosmopolitan reality, where if we simply talk to our friends and our friends of our friends, very quickly we've connected the entire world. But not so fast. Like the Earth at Night map, there are some dark areas on this map where there simply aren't that many computer users. You simply aren't at a level of economic development in most of Central Africa where, despite the fact that you have hundreds of millions of people, you simply don't have many people at this point on Facebook. But that's not the only omission. China is almost entirely missing from this map. And that's because China has been very difficult about blocking access to Facebook, and also because there are other social networks in China that have been more appealing to Chinese populations. And you could look, for instance, at Russia, which again is almost entirely absent from this. And the story there is not a story of censorship. It's actually a story of another powerful social network, VKontakte, which has much better usage in Russia than Facebook does. So your first glance is a connected world. The second glance is a connected world missing some very interesting pieces and questions about why they would want to be there. But I want to complicate this a little further, which is to ask this question of how connected we really are through something like Facebook. It turns out that the average Facebook user has about 130 friends. And this is a number that actually hasn't changed very much. As more and more people come on Facebook, people either end up with under 10 friends, in which case they sort of fail at Facebook, or they end up fairly close to this mean of 130. Now, you may be looking at this and saying, I've got 1,000, and good for you, you're a bit of an outlier. But across the service, 130 is the rough number of connections. Roughly 12% of those connections are international. When you think about that, that's kind of a big number. We're suggesting that the average person has 15 Facebook friends who come from a different country than their country of origin. But that gets a little complicated, and this is the nature of averages. Imagine for a moment that you are from the Philippines and you travel to work in Dubai. You may well have a couple of Facebook friends in Dubai, people that you work with, people you've gotten to know, but you have an enormous number of friends in the Philippines who you're still in touch with. So you register as being in Dubai, because remember, Facebook looks at where you are, not where you say you're from. And 80% of your friendships look international because what you're really doing is remaining in very close touch with your friends at home in the Philippines. This happens a lot. It turns out that that 12% is not evenly distributed. A lot of the people who represent those international ties on Facebook are people who have deep ties to 2 or more countries. They're students studying abroad, they're people who work elsewhere, they're people like me who've lived and worked in another country like Ghana, where I've worked, and we end up sort of skewing those statistics. The truth is, for the most part, Facebook, and in fact most online social networking, is profoundly local. We look at this graph from Johan Ugander, who's been researching at Facebook the last couple of summers, and that line in the center is a line showing very high degree of contact. And that's people on Facebook from Greece who are friends with people in Greece. You can see the darker colors, that represents people in Greece, friends with people in other nations. It's much, much lower. We tend towards friendship in our own nation. We tend towards friendship in near neighbor countries, despite the fact that there are no real barriers preventing us from being friends with anyone anywhere in the world, our tendency is to stay pretty close to home. And the reason for this is a sociological term called homophily. We have a strong tendency as humans to stay close to people who are demographically, socioeconomically similar to ourselves. In the case of Facebook, this makes sense, right? Facebook says, show me who your friends are, tell me where you went to high school, I'm going to keep you connected to all of those things. But what's funny is that Facebook is playing out a tendency that many of us unconsciously play out in our everyday normal lives. If you walk into a college cafeteria, you will see students sitting almost as if they've been segregated by race. And this is not necessarily because students have some terrible form of, institutionalized racism. Colleges actually work very hard to get interracial mixing between students. People will gravitate towards people who feel familiar, who feel safe, who end up having something in common with them in terms of race or religion or socioeconomic status. And when you take this basic tendency and build this into the internet, you end up with some very interesting problems. You end up with a discovery problem. It's hard for us to discover interesting content, interesting links, interesting inspirations from other parts of the world. So here's a really quick history of the last 20 years of how we discover things online. We started online by bringing offline curators into the space. These are things like newspapers like the New York Times, these are television stations, these are magazines. These are the people and institutions that we've trusted for years to sort of say, here's what's going on in the world, here's what we think is important, here, come and pay attention to it. We've then leapt ahead to search engines. And search engines say, I don't have to follow what a curator says is important. I know what's important to me. I'm going to pay attention to that instead. I'm going to follow my own bliss. I'm going to follow my own inspiration. And lately, we're moving into social curation. And this is a moment where we say, well, I want to find something new, but I don't want to find something at random. So let me ask my social network what I should find. Well, these methods all have challenges. Curation, as happens with the front page of a newspaper, is a very, very powerful tool to push you towards the unfamiliar. If the editor of the New York Times says, hey, I know you don't think Cambodia is important, but something happened today that you really need to pay attention to, some large percentage of people are going to go and read that story and find out something about Cambodia. And you would think that at a moment where we have tremendous pressure to understand the connected world, because there's so much economically, so much geopolitically, so much environmentally that comes from our sense of connection, that we would be looking internationally all the time. And the funny thing is that we're not. If you look at how much international news we had on American television in the 1970s, it was roughly 35%. It's dropped to about 12% in the last decade, and it continues to drop. We simply don't report very much on stories of politics in other countries. When we report on war, it's generally wars that the US is involved with. And we see similar drop-offs in other forms of media. And when you think about this, this is really paradoxical. It's much, much easier to report from an earthquake in Haiti right now, based on satellite television, than it was for Walter Cronkite to physically fly to Vietnam, shoot on old-fashioned cameras, load film in reels, ship it back to the United States, develop it, and put it on television. But we actually, in that old heavyweight system, had much more international news. And it's possible that scarcity made it seem more precious, and therefore we invested more heavily in it. It's possible that what's happened instead is the rise of search. And what search basically says is, hey, if you want international news, you can choose it. Just like if you go to a salad bar, you can choose the spinach, or you can choose the olives, or you can choose the cheese. But it's up to you to figure out how you deliver yourself a balanced plate. And one of the questions becomes whether too much choice is actually good for us. One thing that I found in studying choice is that most of us stay close to home. So I started studying what people in the US end up looking at in terms of the media that's available to them online. And as someone in the US, I can read a US newspaper online, I can read blogs online, I can read the Huffington Post. I could also read the BBC or the Times of India. I can read whatever I'm unconstrained by language to seek out and find. And it turns out that Americans as a whole read about 94% media that comes from the US. Now, this is not just because Americans are horrifically parochial and don't pay attention to international news. This is actually an extremely common trend. If you look at the top 10 countries in terms of what they pay attention to, the vast majority of us are getting more than 95% of our news locally. And so one of the things that we're sort of forced to admit in all of this is that what's happened with the internet is that we're theoretically highly global, but we're practically highly local. A lot of the information that most of us encounter day to day is from our local newspapers, our national newspapers. It's not necessarily from that international point of view. Now, this is really contrary to a lot of what some of us expected with the rise of the internet. The idea was that we would suddenly be able to read someone's views in Argentina or Australia, and we would head towards a world that had a fairer distribution of attention or is at least more global in scale. But it turns out that left to our own devices, most of us will make a pretty unhealthy salad at the salad bar. We're going to pick what's familiar and what's comfortable. We're likely to pick more entertainment than we would have picked from a standard newspaper, and we're really likely to stay close to home. So what happens when we go into the world of social? Facebook has now introduced this idea of social graph search. And the idea behind this is that I don't want recommendations from just anyone where I should go for dinner here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. What I really want are the recommendations from people I already know. So I can go to Facebook and I can say, give me restaurants here in Cambridge, Massachusetts that my friends like. And I get a pretty good list of restaurants. I'll tell you what, it's not a particularly surprising list of restaurants. It's very familiar, it's very comfortable, and it's been vetted by my friends. And so if I'm looking to reduce risk, perhaps this is a very good way of doing things. And perhaps if I'm in a very unfamiliar city and I'm worried about a bad meal or an unfamiliar experience, going where my friends have been before is a good way to go. But we should be asking some questions about what we're missing when we're going through something like a social search. Social search is designed not just to give us what we want, which is what we get out of search, but what we want and what our friends have already told us that they are interested in and comfortable with. So we're getting two levers of filtering. We're getting our filter of what we think is important, and then we're getting a second layer of filtering from what our friends already think is important. You can imagine some very different views of Cambridge. I can imagine a version of Facebook that says, show me what restaurants in Cambridge that my Haitian taxi cab driver likes. And there's no reason actually that Facebook can't come up with this. My taxi cab driver, odds are, is actually a Facebook member, or certainly some Haitian taxi cab drivers are on Facebook. But Facebook doesn't make it possible to look at the world this way. Facebook assumes that what's most important to us is what the people we've already chosen, those familiar people, think about the world and where they want to guide us and where they want to push us. So I want to question this set of assumptions. We've been building tools like this because we're trying to make people more comfortable and better consumers. Facebook wants me to be comfortable, they want me to go out and buy because ultimately they want to sell the ability to advertise out there. And that may be fine for me as a consumer, but it may not be very good for me as a civic actor. As a civic actor, Facebook may want to surprise me and make me uncomfortable and make me knowledgeable about things that I didn't think I needed to know. Maybe Facebook should be trying to introduce me to unfamiliar people or to people who could be good bridges between my culture and another culture. But right now, Facebook doesn't have the incentive. My sense is that if we want to use the internet not to sort of reinforce our existing prejudices about what's important and who's important and what and whom we should pay attention to, we need to work very hard to sort of expand our horizons. And my argument is that if we want to get what we want out of this global connected internet, we need to figure out how to translate, how to bridge, and how to discover content that's distant to us. Because if we just rely on what we already understand and what we already know, we're going to end up trapped in a world where we only find out what we already thought was interesting, we already thought was important, and we're going to be perpetually surprised by these important influences that come in globally that we didn't expect to see coming. Where does this take us? A lot of these questions around global civics, for me, come down to this idea of cosmopolitanism. And cosmopolitanism is a complicated word. For many of us, it sort of calls up someone with a passport who flies constantly, is in home in every city. But Kwame Appiah, who's a Ghanaian-American philosopher, offers a much more subtle definition. And what Appiah basically says is that cosmopolitanism demands two things from you. It demands that you understand that there are other different legitimate ways of living in the world. Our way of doing things is not necessarily the only way of doing things, or not necessarily even the best way of doing things. This sounds a lot like cultural relativism to some people. Appiah would argue that it's not a matter of saying what's right for someone else is necessarily right for you, but it's a matter of understanding that there are other cultural contexts that people live in, are embedded within, and are legitimate for where they are. And then Appiah goes a step further and he says, we may have obligations to other people. It's not just enough to acknowledge that people in China or people in Ghana have different values, have different ways of living, but that we are connected to them and we may have an obligation to witness what's going on with them, to try to help if we can, to try to find solutions that take seriously the perspectives that they're coming from and the perspectives that we're coming from. This is really hard to do. For most of us, when we see a problem that's unfolding globally, we are really tempted to step up and say, let me solve that for you. We just saw a really challenging example of this about a year ago, where American activists involved with a group called Invisible Children wanted to call attention to the problem that they saw of the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda, which had a terrible history of kidnapping child soldiers. And so the organizers behind Invisible Children started a campaign to arrest Joseph Kony, Kony 2012. They managed to get 100 million people to watch their YouTube video in about 6 days. And you had lots of young people in America essentially saying, we will stop at nothing to get Joseph Kony. There were a lot of problems with this campaign, but the biggest one was that it largely didn't reflect the perspectives of the people on the ground in Uganda. And you had a lot of people in Uganda essentially saying, this war's been over for 10 years. Kony's not even in our country. He's the next country over. We want to be known as a peaceful place where people can come for business, for tourism. We don't want to be the site for the hunt for Joseph Kony. You're hurting us. We know you're trying to help, but this isn't helping us in one fashion or another. This is a good example of what happens a lot of the time when we look to other parts of the world, but we don't take that time to translate, to bridge, to try to have those deep connections with people in another culture about what we could be doing together. Here's another example, one that worked out significantly better. This is a set of images from the earthquakes that leveled Haiti a couple years ago, and some of the relief efforts that happened coming out of it. There's a group called Ushahidi. It's a group of Kenyan software developers who built a tool for mapping. They built it as a response to the crisis after the 2007 elections in Kenya. It's a tool that lets people send a text message and put a spot on a map reporting an incident, reporting responses to an incident. People use it to monitor elections, and they really use it in situations of crisis. When the Haitian earthquakes leveled much of Port-au-Prince, groups quickly set up an Ushahidi instance to document where people were in trouble, as well as sharing good information, like this tweet talking about someone who says, here's a pharmacy that's open, here's a place that you can go to get medicine. This map ended up serving as the emergency services for Haiti in the immediate wake of the earthquake. People who were there were international aid agencies, ended up leaning on the map to find out where people were hurt and injured and to route resources their way. And they were able to do it because there was a team here in Boston at Tufts University of Haitian Americans who were reading these text messages in Haitian Creole, translating them and putting them together on this map. Here's a moment where in international crisis, you had Haitians in their country and in the US working with software developers in Kenya to build a system deployed in Haiti so that everyone could pull together on a specific crisis. It's not impossible to find these moments where we come together and try to help each other, not by insisting that we have the solution, but by working together to find that common ground. And this is why people like me continue to work in the digital space to think about this as a locus for global civics. One of the major problems of global civics is that if we want to have global civics, we need to have a global perspective. And that means we need to build out a global media. That means we need to think about how not just professional media, but citizen media gives us coverage of ideas from around the globe, but not just how we invite people to stand up and air their voices, but how we take responsibility for listening. How do we learn to pay attention so that we can jointly come together and solve an incredible crisis like the Haitian earthquakes by taking everyone's ideas and finding ways to work together? We're really far from having a definitive answer to this, but what's exciting about this is that the internet, while it does not necessarily turn us into global citizens, is one of the most amazing channels we've ever had to try to figure out how to listen to perspectives from other parts of the world. The challenge for us is that it won't do it automatically. We have to make that decision. We need to decide that what matters to us is thinking of ourselves as citizens of the globe, think of ourselves as being involved with global civics, and starting to build the systems online and off that take us to that worldview. Again, really a privilege to be part of this series. Hope this is helpful in thinking through some of these ideas. This is me. You're welcome to contact me if you want to talk further about this, either via email or via Twitter. Really looking forward to reactions and questions online. Thanks again for the opportunity, and thanks for being with me.
So Ethan Zuckerman has a more nuanced understanding of the global village. He shows us that yes, atoms and bytes, that is goods, ideas, people are moving faster and more easily than before, but this does not automatically mean that every idea and every human being is equally accessible. He argues that a truly global awareness is hard work. He challenges us to maintain an active curiosity so that we can have a global awareness, a global conscience that is commensurate with our increasing interdependence. For this week, there is no reading or writing assignment, but I will ask you to choose 2 countries that you are not familiar with, and I want you to go through Jan Arhus's photographs and choose 2 people. These 2 countries and 2 people will stay with you for the rest of the course. Every time we come up with a new policy idea, every time we identify a new dynamic, I want you to view these dynamics through the eyes of these 2 people and these 2 countries. Choose them now, and they will stay with you for the rest of the course.